Great Inland Sea extends from about down to Errol-Dunda in the south to as far north as Tennant Creek. East and west about the same distance. So it's about 600 kilometers long and approximately 500 or 600 kilometers wide. What it is a very shallow sea that developed about 900 million years ago. These would have been fairly warm and had wide shorelines, and we can sort of tell this from looking at the stratigraphy of some of the sediments that left. Perhaps the Devonport Ranges and the Tennant Creek Inlier, some of those granites were islands. So imagine a shallow, bit choppy kind of a sea in a huge plain with a few rather desolate looking islands sticking up, and you've got it about 900 million years ago.
I've walked around on the West Macs and you see these big rounded rocks, you know, too heavy to lift, that have been washed down by these huge streams that came off these hills when they were jungle covered. And then you go to other parts and you see the ripple marks and the tracks of animals that were living in the bottom of the sea when this was an inland sea. And it's impossible for your mind to stretch back and imagine that far back, all the things that have gone on here.
It formed in a very large basin. The main part of the basin is what we call the Amadeus Basin. And that, in fact, constitutes the eastern and western McDonnell Ranges, because the sediments that sea laid down were captured in this basin, the deeper part of the basin, and these were subsequently folded up into the mountain ranges that we know today. The earliest part of this sequence of a very, very long history of the inland sea in central Australia is shown by the heavy tree quartzite. So when you come through the gap into Alice Springs, the large ridges of reddish quartzite are actually the lowest part, or the basal part, of the sediments of the inland sea. So in fact, you have to look up at the inland sea now, whereas before it was actually a fairly deep basin. And finally, by about 350 million years ago, the inland sea has dried up, and we get a whole sequence of sediments laid down that show this process of the inland sea finally drying up and blowing away, including mud cracks, salt flats, and all those kinds of evaporation phenomena that you would expect as the tide goes out.
Stowe was an observant bloke. He got these stories from the Bushmen saying that they could see these water birds flying into the inland of Australia. So it seemed fairly obvious that there must be a sea in there. And that's why he set off into this part of the world looking for, taking a boat with him, looking for this inland sea. And it's true that water birds do head off into the desert. You know, swans from around Melbourne end up on a lake in the Tanami Desert. And this is still one of the biggest puzzles in the whole story of birds in Australia. How do they know? Because the inland sea has dried up a long time ago. How do they know?